The dropship cut through the last layer of thin frozen clouds and descended into the endless darkness of Varus 9. Below stretched an ocean of snow and jagged ice ridges that shimmered under the faint glow of the planet's 2 frozen moons. The cadets inside the craft sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the temperature gauge sank lower and lower. This was the final trial of the Galactic Academy's survival program, a test meant to push every species to its breaking point. The mission was simple in theory: survive 1 planetary rotation of the polar night, nearly 100 days of freezing winds, no sunlight, and no assistance. But everyone knew that nothing about Varus 9 was simple. When the rear hatch opened, the first gust of wind hit like a living thing, tearing through clothing and burning exposed skin. The reptilian cadets hissed in pain as frost gathered along their scales, while the insectoids scuttled instinctively toward the meager crates of supplies, trying to shield themselves from the storm. The avian Zyri, tall creatures covered in dense feathers, spread their wings for balance, but immediately folded them in again as the wind threatened to snap them. Elias Grant, the only human in the group, stepped onto the ice and squinted against the blinding snow. The air clawed at his lungs with every breath, but he forced himself to stand tall, scanning the horizon where no landmark or shelter could be seen. Only flat white emptiness stretched in all directions, disturbed occasionally by the black silhouette of a distant glacier. The instructor's voice echoed from the comm device on his wrist, announcing that the trial had begun. The dropship lifted off, leaving a whirl of frozen dust in its wake, and then vanished into the upper atmosphere. For the first time, the group stood alone on a planet where life itself seemed like an insult to the cold. The first hours were chaos. Each species immediately tried to take charge, arguing in overlapping bursts of different languages. The reptilians, whose blood cooled too quickly, wanted to dig burrows into the ice. The insectoids insisted on building webbed shelters from resin they produced, while the avians mocked everyone and claimed the higher ground, saying that wind currents could lead them to better terrain. Elias said little. He watched as precious hours were wasted on disputes instead of preparation. By the time a rough consensus was reached, the temperature had dropped another 20 degrees, and the light from the moons was nearly gone. The group began assembling a circle of tents using the thin polymer fabric from the supply crates. Elias helped where he could, but he noticed immediately that the materials were poor, clearly chosen by the Academy to test creativity more than endurance. When the wind howled again, half the tents ripped open like paper. One of the insectoids screamed as the icy air cut through its chitin armor, and the others panicked, trying to seal the holes with resin that hardened too slowly to be useful in the cold. That first night, the temperature reached minus 82 degrees. Elias lay awake inside a half-collapsed tent, listening to the muffled cries outside. He had wrapped himself in every layer of clothing he had, but the cold still reached into his bones. He tried to keep his mind busy, counting heartbeats, focusing on his breathing, refusing to let his body slip into the deadly calm of hypothermia. Around midnight, the wind subsided enough for him to crawl outside. The camp looked like a graveyard of abandoned hopes. Several cadets huddled together in silence, and 2 reptilians no longer moved. Frost coated their eyes like glass. Elias knelt beside them for a moment, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He knew the instructors would not intervene. Death was part of the lesson. He stood again and looked around, noticing small clumps of feathers scattered across the snow, carried by the wind from where the Zyri had nested. The avians shed them naturally under stress, but instead of gathering the warm down, they had tossed it aside, considering it useless now that it was no longer attached to their bodies. Elias crouched, lifted a handful, and felt the soft insulation between his fingers. It was dry, light, and surprisingly warm. An idea began to take shape in his mind, faint but growing. The next day brought no sunrise, only a slightly lighter shade of darkness. The storm had passed, leaving a brittle silence across the ice. The surviving cadets emerged, faces pale and eyes sunken. The Zyri matriarch, Sir Cathal, stood near the center of camp, her wings folded tightly around her body. She called out in her native tongue, her voice a mixture of pride and warning. She ordered her kin to rebuild the shelters higher, using windbreaks of snow, and refused assistance from any non-Zyri. The insectoids ignored her and began melting ice for water using the last of their portable heat cells. The reptilians huddled close to the remaining fires, unwilling to move. Elias wandered alone beyond the camp, gathering more feathers until his arms were full. Some were blue, others silver-gray, all carrying faint traces of warmth. He also collected sinew from a frozen carcass half buried in the snow, one of the native frost beasts that had likely died during migration. With effort, he pulled free what he could and carried everything back to his tent. Inside, he set to work. His fingers were stiff and nearly numb, but he had always been good with his hands. He tore thin strips of sinew, drying them over the faint heat of a chemical cell, twisting them into thread. He carved a crude needle from bone, sharpening the tip against a piece of broken polymer. For hours he worked, ignoring hunger and fatigue, sewing patches of feathered hide together. The process was slow and painful. Every few minutes he had to pause to breathe warmth into his hands or press them against the heat cell. But gradually, the shape of a parka began to emerge. When it was finished, it was uneven and rough, the stitches crooked and messy, yet it felt heavier and warmer than anything else in camp. He wrapped himself in it, pulling the hood over his head, and for the first time since landing on Varus 9, he felt the faint luxury of retained heat. He stepped outside again, the snow crunching under his boots, and looked around at the others struggling to survive. Some cadets stared at him in disbelief. To them, the coat looked primitive, almost ridiculous. But Elias didn't care. The wind that froze them barely touched him now. He used the advantage to gather more firewood from the limited supply of frozen drift and scavenged broken parts from the supply crates to form wind barriers. When he returned to camp, several insectoids approached him, their antennae twitching with curiosity. He showed them how the feathers trapped heat and how to sew them together using their natural resin instead of thread. Soon, a few others began trying to imitate his work. By nightfall, 3 cadets had fashioned crude cloaks from the discarded feathers. The HFY matriarch, watching from a distance, seemed both annoyed and intrigued. She had always believed her species superior in adaptation, yet the human had done what her own people had not, used their waste to create survival. That night, another storm struck without warning. Wind howled across the ice plains, tearing through the brittle tents once more. But this time, Elias stood firm outside, adjusting the windbreaks he had built earlier. The cold bit into his face, but his body remained warm under the layered parka. He could see the faint light of terrified eyes through the torn shelters, and he shouted directions telling everyone to reinforce their camps with packed snow instead of flimsy poles. Some listened, others were too scared to move. By morning, half the camp's shelters were buried, and several cadets suffered frostbite. Yet Elias was still on his feet, breathing heavily, his beard crusted with ice. As he looked over the devastation, one thought solidified in his mind. If the group continued like this, none would last a week. He had survived the first 2 days through improvisation, but survival alone was not enough. The only way to endure the polar night was to adapt, and teach others to do the same. He returned to his tent, sat beside the dying heat cell, and tightened the seams of his parka. The feathers fluttered softly in the dim light, whispering like a promise. The cold outside growled against the tent walls, but he felt its power fading, little by little. He thought of the instructors who were surely watching from orbit, recording every desperate moment. He wondered if they had expected any human to last this long. Maybe they thought he would break like the rest. He smiled faintly in the dark, knowing he would not. The planet wanted to take his warmth, but he had already stolen some of its secrets. The frozen world of Varus 9 had just met a creature who refused to die quietly. The wind that had screamed through the night finally weakened to a low moan that drifted across the frozen plain like a ghost. The camp was half buried in snow, and the morning brought no light, only a softer shade of darkness beneath the twin moons. Elias emerged from his shelter slowly, his limbs stiff, his breath freezing in the air. The others were beginning to stir, though sluggishly. His eyes swept the camp and found several cadets too weak to stand. The reptilian group was huddled together around the last glowing fragments of a heat cell, their scales dull and cracked. The insectoids scraped at the ice for frozen water, their limbs trembling. The HFY matriarch stood apart, tall and silent, her feathers heavy with frost. The storm had changed everything. The arrogance that had filled the group during their arrival had been stripped away by the cold. The survival test was no longer about pride or competition. It had become something far simpler. Who would live to see the next dusk? Elias tightened the belt around his parka and started working before anyone else could speak. He began rebuilding the camp's perimeter with blocks of compressed snow, stacking them in a low wall to blunt the wind. The others watched for a while but did not move to help. He ignored them and focused on rhythm, lift, press, pack, repeat, until his gloves were stiff with frost. The movement kept his body warm and his mind focused. When he paused to catch his breath, he saw Circatal watching him from across the camp. Her dark eyes were sharp, intelligent, and full of questions she did not yet voice. She was proud, but she was also curious. He nodded to her once, a quiet acknowledgement, then returned to his work. By midday, he had built a crude circle of windbreaks around the main camp. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He gathered the few insectoids who were still mobile and showed them how to reinforce the walls with resin to hold the snow in place. They clicked their mandibles in hesitant approval and mimicked his movements. Once the wall was secure, Elias set about making something that had been missing since the beginning: a reliable fire. The last chemical cells were nearly spent, and the reptilians guarded the remaining fuel like treasure. He offered to trade a piece of dried meat he had saved from the last hunt, and after some resistance, they gave him a single cell. Using it, he lit the pile of driftwood he had gathered during the storm and built a steady flame that burned brighter than any before. For the first time in days, the camp smelled of warmth rather than fear. As the flame caught, several cadets drifted closer, drawn by instinct. Elias stepped back and let them crowd around, knowing that the heat would do more than warm their bodies. It would remind them what life felt like. He noticed how the Zyri stood at the edge of the group, refusing to appear dependent. Yet even they leaned subtly toward the light, their feathers rippling with the faint heat. When he caught Circathal's gaze again, she did not turn away. She studied him as though reassessing everything she had assumed about the human species. Humans were known throughout the academy as reckless, impulsive, and soft-skinned. Yet the one standing before her had endured what most of her kind could not. Later, while the others ate and rested, Elias took a small knife he had fashioned from scrap metal and began trimming the rough edges of his coat. He tightened seams, added layers of resin to waterproof it, and adjusted the hood. The Zyri cadets whispered among themselves, fascinated by his strange garment. Eventually, one of the younger females approached him, shy and hesitant. She held out a small bundle of feathers she had gathered during her own molting and asked, through broken galactic common, if he could make her something similar. Elias smiled faintly and nodded. Together, they sat by the fire, working in silence. Her feathers were finer and softer than the ones he had used, and as he stitched them into the fabric, he realized the material held heat even better. The young Zyri watched carefully, learning every motion of his hands. When he handed her the finished piece, a shoulder wrap designed to keep warmth near the lungs, she bowed her head in quiet gratitude. That night, the temperature plummeted again, but the fire burned longer than before. Elias sat beside it, the young Zyri resting nearby, wrapped in her new garment. Across the camp, Circatal stood watching the flames. The faint orange light flickered across her silver feathers, and for a brief moment she looked almost human in her stillness. After a long pause, she approached. Her steps were deliberate, her expression unreadable. When she stopped in front of him, she extended one clawed hand and dropped something into the snow between them, a bundle of large, deep blue feathers. "Use them," she said in slow, accented words. "Better than the small ones." He nodded, understanding what the gesture meant. It was not charity. It was respect. Over the next few days, the camp began to transform. Elias spent his waking hours improving the shelters, teaching others how to line them with feathers, hide, and layers of snow for insulation. The insectoids wove strands of resin through the seams, sealing the warmth inside. The reptilians, who had previously refused to work, now helped dig storage pits beneath the snow to keep food from freezing solid. For the first time since the drop, the camp no longer looked like a scattering of hopeless creatures. It looked like a settlement, temporary but organized. The air inside the circle of shelters was warmer, carrying the faint scent of cooked meat and resin smoke. Still, not everything was harmony. Some cadets resented his leadership, whispering that the human had only survived by luck. One of the reptilian males, a broad-shouldered brute with cracked scales, challenged him openly, claiming that his species was stronger and better suited to rule. Elias did not respond with anger. Instead, he handed the reptilian a bundle of feathers and a bone needle. "Make your own warmth," he said calmly. "Then we'll see who leads." The reptilian hesitated, unsure whether the challenge was mockery or wisdom. By the end of the day, he too was wearing a crude cloak, and his resentment turned into reluctant admiration. The Zairi, meanwhile, began shedding more feathers deliberately. They had seen how valuable the discarded down had become, and treated it as currency, trading feathers for food or resin. Elias watched this new economy emerge and realized how quickly survival reshaped civilization. What began as desperation was now invention. He collected the finest feathers and began constructing a new parka, one not just for survival, but for movement. His plan was to hunt beyond the safety of the camp's perimeter. The food stock was dwindling, and if they didn't find fresh meat soon, the shelters would become tombs. When he finally announced his intent to hunt, Circathal stepped forward immediately. "You do not know this world," she said, her tone sharp but not hostile. "Its predators hunt by silence. You will not return." Elias met her eyes and replied, "Then teach me how to hear them." The matriarch studied him for a long moment before nodding. "At dawn, we go." The phrase was simple, but it carried the weight of alliance. For the first time in the history of the Academy's trials, a Zairi matriarch had agreed to hunt beside a human. That night, Elias barely slept. He sat near the fire, sharpening his spear and checking the bindings on his boots. The young Zairi, who had helped him before, lingered nearby, watching anxiously. "She does not hunt with others," she whispered. "If she takes you, she has seen something in you worth testing." Elias said nothing, though her words stayed in his mind. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the frozen world eerily still. The stars were sharp and endless above the horizon, reflected in the ice like shards of glass. He looked out into the black expanse where he would walk in the morning and wondered what kind of beasts could survive in a place so hostile. Whatever they were, he would face them with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him through every storm. When dawn, if it could be called that, finally came, the faint glow of the moons outlined the camp in silver. Circathal waited at the edge of the perimeter, her feathers slicked down for silence. She carried no weapon, only a set of sharpened talons bound with metal rings. Elias approached her, his parka sealed tight, his spear balanced across his shoulder. No words were exchanged. She turned and began walking into the white void, and he followed. Behind them, the camp slowly faded from sight, swallowed by the swirling frost. The hunt had begun, and with it, a fragile partnership that would determine not only their survival, but the fate of every cadet left shivering in the shadows of Varus 9. The wind was gone, replaced by a vast, suffocating silence that pressed against the eardrums like weight. Elias followed Circathal across the frozen plain, his breath rising in faint plumes of vapor that caught the dim moonlight. The snow beneath his boots crunched softly, but the sound felt intrusive in this endless quiet. Circathal moved with a grace that no human could match. Her talons barely disturbed the surface of the ice, and her silver feathers blended with the pale horizon until she looked more like a phantom than a living creature. She did not speak, and Elias did not ask where they were going. He knew that in this world, words could betray presence faster than footsteps. The air smelled sharp, metallic, as if frozen minerals hung in suspension. Every few minutes, she would stop suddenly and lower her head, her feathers vibrating faintly in a way he did not understand. He realized she was listening, not with ears, but through the subtle tremors of the ground. Somewhere out there, beyond sight, something was moving. After an hour of walking, they reached a stretch of uneven terrain where the ice was cracked into ridges. The faint glow of the moons revealed strange patterns carved by wind, long grooves and spirals that looked almost deliberate. Circathal crouched and gestured for him to do the same. He obeyed, lowering himself behind a ridge and peering into the valley below. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught movement. A pack of low, four-legged creatures covered in fur so white it nearly vanished against the snow. Their eyes reflected faint red light, and steam rose from their nostrils as they exhaled. Each one moved with uncanny coordination, heads turning in unison as if guided by one mind. Circathal leaned close and whispered, her voice almost part of the wind. "Frost beasts," she said. "You see the leader, the one with the thicker mane? Kill him first. The rest will scatter." Elias nodded slowly, studying the beasts. He had hunted before on Earth, but nothing like this. These creatures moved with intelligence. Their formation was precise, their senses sharpened by centuries of surviving in a place that devoured weakness. He examined his spear. The point was crude but strong enough to pierce hide. He adjusted the balance in his hand, steadying his breathing. Circathal extended her talons, each one gleaming faintly under the moonlight. She waited for him to signal readiness. He gave a single nod, and then she moved like lightning. She leapt from the ridge, her wings snapping open for just a second to gain momentum before she descended silently onto the nearest beast. Her talons struck deep, and a muffled cry broke the stillness. Elias rushed down behind her, snow spraying with each step. The pack reacted instantly, scattering in confusion, their red eyes flashing as they circled the two intruders. One lunged toward him from the left, jaws wide, and he thrust the spear forward with both hands, feeling it sink into flesh. The creature's momentum drove it closer, and he twisted, pulling the weapon free before it could drag him down. The air filled with steam and the copper scent of blood. Circathal was a blur beside him, striking and withdrawing, never staying still long enough for the beast to retaliate. Her movements were precise, almost dance-like, each strike guided by centuries of instinct. The fight was short, but brutal. When the last beast fell, the world returned to silence, broken only by the rasp of their breathing. Elias stood over the largest carcass, his arms trembling from exertion. Circathal straightened, her feathers ruffled and stained with blood. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she tilted her head slightly, regarding him with a strange expression, half respect, half curiosity. "You did not freeze," she said quietly. "You moved with the storm." Elias smiled faintly, wiping the blade of his spear against the snow. "You said to kill the leader first," he replied. "I figured I should listen." She gave a soft, almost imperceptible laugh. It was the first time he had heard anything resembling amusement from her. Together, they began the slow process of butchering the beasts. Elias worked methodically, cutting meat into manageable portions and wrapping them in hide. Circathal separated feathers and tendons, explaining their uses in her clipped, precise way. "The sinew can be boiled," she said. "It makes strong binding. The fur, keep it dry. It holds heat better than any feather." He followed her instructions carefully, memorizing each step. The blood steamed in the cold, creating small crimson clouds that drifted away into the wind. The smell would draw scavengers soon, so they worked quickly. Once they had gathered what they could carry, Circathal stood and pointed toward a ridge of dark stone in the distance. "We rest there. The rock holds heat longer than ice." The journey to the ridge took nearly 2 hours. By the time they reached it, Elias's legs ached from trudging through deep snow while carrying the heavy load of meat. When they finally stopped, Circathal found a hollow in the rock wall where wind had carved a shallow cave. It was just large enough for 2 people to sit. Elias built a small fire from frozen driftwood and a single fuel cell while Circathal arranged the meat to dry on her claws. As the flames grew, shadows danced across the cave walls, and for the first time since they had met, the matriarch spoke openly. "When I was young," she began, "I took this same trial. I was not yet a matriarch then. I watched 3 of my sisters die on this world. One froze in her sleep. One fell through thin ice. The last went mad and walked into the dark. I survived because I learned to listen. Every sound in this cold has meaning. The cracking ice, the shifting wind. Even silence tells you when death is near." Elias listened quietly, feeding another piece of wood into the fire. Her voice carried no trace of sorrow, only memory. "And now you teach others," he said. She nodded once. "But I did not expect to teach a human. Your kind does not belong in such places." He smiled faintly. "Neither do you. Yet here you are." Her eyes glinted in the firelight. "Perhaps we both belong where others cannot." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of mutual recognition, 2 survivors acknowledging each other without the need for ceremony. They took turns keeping watch through the night. When it was his turn, Elias sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen wasteland beyond the cave's mouth. The stars above Varus 9 seemed closer than those of Earth, sharp and cold, like eyes watching from the void. He thought about the camp and the faces of those still struggling to survive. The food he carried could save them, but he also knew that survival was not just about hunger, it was about hope, and right now, the camp had none. He looked back at Sir Cathal, who was resting with her wings half folded, her chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. She had trusted him enough to sleep, and that trust meant more than words. When morning came, though the world never truly brightened, they began the journey back. The return was slower, burdened by the heavy load. The cold gnawed at their limbs, and the snow blinded their eyes. Once, when he stumbled, Sir Cathal reached out instinctively and caught his arm, her talons firm but careful. She did not speak, but her gesture said enough. They pressed on, step by step, until the first faint outlines of the camp came into view. The smoke from the central fire rose like a fragile thread into the dark sky. As they entered the perimeter, the cadets rushed to meet them. The sight of fresh meat and furs sent a ripple of disbelief through the group. The young Zairi, who had helped him earlier, let out a cry of joy, her feathers flaring with color. Elias dropped the bundle of food near the main fire and watched as the cadets gathered around. Sir Cathal raised her voice above the murmurs. "The human hunted with me," she declared. "He brought food when none of you could. He listens to this world. Listen to him." The statement carried more weight than any command. For a Zairi matriarch to publicly acknowledge another being as equal, or even as a guide, was almost unthinkable. That night, the camp transformed again. Fires burned brighter, and laughter returned in hesitant bursts. The smell of cooked meat filled the air, mingling with the hum of alien voices. Elias sat by the fire, his body aching but his mind restless. He could feel the shift happening around him. No longer an outsider, he was becoming something else, something larger. Sir Cathal sat across from him, silent, her expression unreadable. When the young Zairi brought him a bowl of cooked meat, she gave him a small nod before retreating. The warmth of the food spread through his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel something close to peace. The camp was alive again. The trial was far from over, but the tide had turned. The human who had once been a stranger was now the reason the others believed they might survive the endless night of Varus 9. The days that followed the hunt reshaped the rhythm of life on Varus 9. The camp that had once been little more than a desperate scattering of tents now moved with order and purpose. The cadets, once isolated by species and mistrust, had begun to act as a single living organism. The air was still bitter and sharp, but the silence no longer carried despair. There was sound now, axes striking frozen wood, claws scraping at ice, voices murmuring plans. Elias rose before the others each morning, his breath fogging the dim light as he checked the perimeter and rebuilt the fire before it died completely. He had become something he had never planned to be, a leader not by command but by necessity. Every movement around him carried his influence. The insectoids had learned to weave resin into sheets for insulation. The reptilians carved trenches to direct wind flow away from shelters. And the Zairi, proud and elegant, flew short reconnaissance arcs despite the strain on their wings. Sir Cathal observed all of this with silent approval, though she never once said the word leader. She didn't have to. Her eyes told him that she understood the truth. Survival had chosen him. The camp's heart was the communal hearth, a large pit lined with stone and reinforced by resin. Elias had designed it himself, recalling fragments of old documentaries about Arctic explorers and frontier pioneers. Around that fire, the cadets shared food and stories in a dozen languages. At first, conversation was simple, requests for tools, warnings about the weather, but soon it became something more. Laughter returned, cautious but real. Elias often sat slightly apart, not because he wished to be distant, but because he was always thinking ahead. His mind never stopped calculating how much meat remained, how long the resin walls could hold, how to prepare for the next storm. Each choice felt like a balance between science and instinct. One evening, as he tended the central fire, Sir Cathal approached. The light caught the faint silver gleam of her feathers, and her eyes glowed like cold metal. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You have changed this place," she said quietly. "Before, it was only fear. Now it breathes." Elias poked at the embers and smiled faintly. "It's not me. It's everyone working together," She tilted her head. "You're wrong. Without a spine, the body collapses. You are the spine." He looked up at her, unsure how to answer, and she continued, her voice softer. "When this trial ends, the instructors will see only statistics, who lived, who did not. But those of us who return will carry this place in our blood. We will speak of the human who built warmth where there was none." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't come here to be remembered. I just wanted to survive." Her feathers rippled in faint amusement. "And yet, that is exactly why you will be remembered." The following week brought the worst blizzard yet. The sky darkened until even the moons vanished behind a curtain of storm clouds. The wind screamed like a living creature, pulling at the resin walls and driving shards of ice through every gap. The temperature plunged so low that exposed metal shattered like glass. The cadets huddled in the main shelter, wrapped in their feathered cloaks, waiting for the storm to pass. Elias moved constantly through the narrow tunnels that connected each section of the camp, checking for leaks and collapses. Snow and ice clung to his beard, and frost burned his fingertips through his gloves, but he refused to stop. When one of the reptilian shelters began to cave in, he was the first to reach it, bracing the wall with his shoulder while others reinforced it with resin. For hours he fought against the storm until his body ached and his vision blurred from exhaustion. At last, when the wind began to fade, he stumbled back into the central chamber. His legs felt heavy, his lips numb, but when he looked around and saw everyone still alive, something deep inside him steadied. The storm had not broken them. It had welded them together. As the others slept, Circathal sat beside him in silence. After a while, she spoke, her voice almost lost in the hiss of melting snow. "When I first saw you, I thought you would die within days. Humans are soft, I said to myself. Too fragile for true cold. I was wrong. You do not fight the cold. You make it part of you." Elias leaned back against the wall, too tired to reply. He simply smiled, and that was enough. When the skies finally cleared, the world outside had changed. The once flat plains were now carved into smooth white hills where the snow had piled high. The camp stood in the middle like an island of order in a frozen sea. Elias led the rebuilding efforts, improving what had barely survived the storm. He designed new vents to redirect smoke, trenches to catch meltwater, and even a small forge made from stone and heated air ducts. The others followed his instructions without hesitation now. Each task had become part of a rhythm, and the rhythm was survival. The camp no longer feared the night. It endured it. Weeks passed. The endless dark began to lift slightly, revealing a faint glow on the horizon that hinted at the distant sun. The worst of the trial was nearly over. One evening, as Elias walked the perimeter, he stopped and looked up. The stars shimmered like frost, and for the first time since arriving, he saw a faint blue arc sweeping across the sky. The planetary aurora. It rippled like a curtain of light, silent and ethereal. He stood there for a long time watching it, feeling something strange stir inside him. He realized he had grown to love this brutal world. It was harsh and unrelenting, but it was honest. Every breath here meant something. Every heartbeat was earned. That night, the cadets gathered for what had become a ritual. The shared meal at the end of each 7-day cycle was a time of unity, a brief reprieve from the struggle. Elias sat beside the fire, surrounded by faces that once saw him as a stranger and now saw him as kin. Circathal sat opposite him, her feathers glowing faintly in the firelight. The young Zairi, who had once asked him for help, now wore a full cloak of her own making. The reptilian who had challenged him earlier handed out food with quiet respect. The insectoids clicked in rhythmic gratitude as they passed around the hot stones that served as improvised plates. For the first time, there was peace. As the meal ended, Circathal stood and raised her voice. "Listen," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "When the instructors return, we will go back to our worlds. We will be called cadets again, and this will be labeled only a test. But what we built here is more than that. We built a village. We built trust." She turned her gaze toward Elias. "And we built it because one human refused to die alone." The others murmured in agreement, some raising hands or claws in silent salute. Elias felt a flush of embarrassment rise to his cheeks. He had never wanted recognition, but in that moment, he understood what this meant. This wasn't a ceremony, it was gratitude. It was acknowledgement from beings who had never before shared warmth with another species. Later, after the fire burned low, Circathal approached him privately. "There is one last thing I wish to show you," she said. She led him beyond the camp, up a small ridge that overlooked the frozen valley. The night was calm, the air crisp and still. From this vantage, the aurora was brighter, painting the ice below in shades of green and violet. "Do you see that?" she asked. "Those lights mean the night is ending. Soon, the sun will rise again." Elias nodded, his breath catching in the cold. "I didn't think I'd live to see it." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You earned it. When this trial ends, you will not return the same. None of us will." For a long while they stood in silence, watching the sky shift from darkness to pale blue. The first rays of sunlight touched the farthest edge of the horizon, and for a fleeting moment, the ice glowed like gold. It was fragile and fleeting, but it was real. Circathal folded her wings slowly and said, "When we leave, I will tell my people about this, about you, not as a story of survival, but as proof that the cold does not care what species you are. It only respects those who adapt." Elias smiled faintly, his face lit by the rising sun. "Then tell them we adapted together." She inclined her head in agreement. The dawn spread across Varus 9 like a blessing. The village they had built from desperation now stood as a testament to unity born from suffering. The human who had come to this world with nothing but instinct had become its architect of warmth. The Zyri matriarch who had once doubted him now stood at his side as an equal. The long polar night was over, but its lessons would never fade. As the light grew stronger, Elias felt the heat on his face and realized that for the first time in months, the cold no longer defined him. It had shaped him, refined him, and made him something new, something unbreakable. When the first full sunrise finally came to Varus 9, it was almost too bright to look at. The endless night that had defined their lives for so long ended without fanfare. No sound, no ceremony, only a pale gold light crawling slowly across the frozen horizon. Elias stood outside the camp, snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath curling upward in the thawing air. The warmth of the rising sun felt foreign, almost uncomfortable against skin that had learned only to know cold. Behind him, the camp was stirring. Doors opened, voices called softly, and creatures of a dozen worlds stepped out to see the day they had begun to think would never return. Some cried openly, others simply stood in silence. The trial was over, though no one had yet said the words aloud. The snow was melting around the hearth pits, and thin streams of water glistened like threads of glass between the shelters. For the first time in months, Elias could hear something other than the wind, the faint drip of melting ice, the quiet hum of new life awakening beneath the surface. Circathal approached from behind, her feathers catching the sunlight like mirrors. The silver sheen of her plumage had dulled through the long winter, but now it shimmered again with a vitality that matched the returning light. She stopped beside him, saying nothing at first. For a moment, they simply stood together, the human and the matriarch, both changed in ways that words could not capture. "The sun," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "It feels different now." Elias nodded slowly. "It does. It feels earned." She looked at him with the faintest trace of a smile before turning her gaze back to the horizon. "The ships will come soon. The Academy will retrieve us and call this trial a success. They will measure our strength, record our performance, and file it all away under data. But none of that will show what truly happened here." Elias knew she was right. The numbers would never capture the nights when the fire almost died, the mornings when frost took another life, or the way strangers became kin beneath the same roof. By midday, the sound of engines broke the stillness, a deep, resonant hum that echoed across the plain. The dropships were descending, their silver hulls slicing through the thin atmosphere. The cadets gathered in silence, shielding their eyes against the brightness of the reflected light. For many, the sight brought relief. For others, it brought confusion. The idea of leaving the camp felt wrong, as if tearing down something sacred that had grown from suffering. Elias felt both emotions at once. He turned to Circathal, who was watching the ship's approach with unreadable eyes. "You're going home," he said quietly. "To your people, to your sky." She inclined her head. "And you, human, will go back to yours. But you will never be the same." He smiled faintly, though his throat tightened at the thought. "No," he said. "I won't." When the ships landed, a cold metallic smell filled the air. Instructors in insulated suits stepped out, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. They moved efficiently, scanning survivors, taking records, asking questions that felt almost absurd in their simplicity. "How many of you remain?" one asked through a translator. "What was the duration of active distress?" Another instructor recorded the temperature readings, the state of the shelters, the condition of the cadets. None of them asked how it felt to look death in the eye and build warmth from feathers and stone. None asked what it meant to earn another creature's trust when every instinct screamed to stay divided. To them, it was all part of the data. But Elias knew that the truth of this world could not be written in numbers. It lived in scars, in stories, in the way each survivor's eyes carried something wild and bright that had not been there before. Before boarding, the cadets dismantled the camp. It was a quiet, almost reverent process. No one wanted to leave waste behind, and more than that, no one wanted to see the place decay without purpose. The hearth that had once been the heart of their survival was dismantled stone by stone. Elias removed the final rock himself, its surface blackened by months of fire. He held it for a long time before setting it gently on the snow. "Goodbye, old friend," he murmured. The young Zairi, who had once helped him sew his first garment, approached and placed a single feather on top of the stone. "So it remembers us," she said softly. Elias smiled, though his eyes burned. He wanted to believe the planet would remember. Perhaps it would. The wind would carry traces of smoke and resin. The ice would hold faint impressions of footprints. Maybe, in some small way, Varus 9 would keep a memory of those who refused to surrender to its cold. When the last of the supplies were loaded, Circathal approached him one final time. She carried a small bundle wrapped in hide. "Take this," she said, holding it out. He opened it and found a single feather, longer and brighter than the rest, deep silver edged with blue. "It was mine once," she said. "We shed them in youth, but the first molt marks the beginning of survival. You earned it." Elias stared at the gift, unsure what to say. "I can't take this," he began, but she placed her hand firmly on his shoulder. "You already have," she said. "The bond between us was forged in the cold. It does not end when the sun rises." He nodded slowly, his throat tight, and carefully tucked the feather into the lining of his coat. "I'll keep it safe," he said quietly. "And I'll remember." She gave him one last look, a look not of command but of friendship, before turning to board her ship. Her feathers caught the sunlight one last time before disappearing into the metallic shadows of the hatch. Elias was the last aboard the human craft. As he climbed the ramp, he looked back one final time. The camp was gone, its traces already softening under the weight of fresh snow. The horizon stretched endlessly, the light golden and calm. The place that had once seemed like death itself now looked almost peaceful. He thought of the first night, the chaos, the cold, the fear, and then of the warmth, the firelight reflected in the eyes of those who had become family. The engines roared, and the view began to sink beneath him. Varus 9 grew smaller, its ice fields shining like glass under the rising sun. The journey back to the academy was silent. The cadets slept, exhausted, their bodies craving rest after months of tension. Elias sat by the window, watching the stars blur past. The hum of the ship was steady, mechanical, almost comforting after so long in the unpredictable wild. But his mind was not on the stars. It was on the memory of wind against his face, of snow under his boots, of Circathal's voice echoing softly in the storm. He thought about what survival really meant. It wasn't about endurance alone. It was about creation. On that frozen world, he had built something that no technology could replace. A bond between species, a shared understanding born of hardship. When the ship finally docked at the Academy station, the survivors were greeted with celebration. Applause echoed through the hangar as officers and instructors lined the walkway. Cameras flashed, recording every face, every tear. But to Elias, the noise felt hollow. The true victory had happened far from these walls, under the pale moons of a planet that no one here would ever understand. He stood quietly as medals were offered, as ranks were restored, as names were read aloud. When it was his turn, an instructor shook his hand and said, "Remarkable adaptation, Cadet Grant. You demonstrated extraordinary initiative under pressure. Humanity's representatives will be proud." Elias only nodded, offering a polite smile. There was nothing to say. Words could not explain what had happened on Varus 9, and he did not intend to try. Later that night, he sat alone in his quarters, the artificial warmth of the room almost unbearable after months of clean, honest cold. He took the feather from his coat and turned it over in his hands. Under the light, it shimmered faintly, reflecting shades of blue and silver. He placed it carefully on his desk, then opened the small window to let a breath of cold air inside. It wasn't the same. It lacked the purity, the bite, but it was enough to make him close his eyes and remember the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the soft rustle of feathers, the silence of a world where survival was the only truth. When he finally looked out at the stars, he found Varus 9 among them, a faint glimmer of blue-white light barely visible to the naked eye. He raised his hand in quiet salute. "We built warmth," he whispered, "and it will never fade." The words were simple, but they carried everything that had been forged in the ice: struggle, loss, unity, hope. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the Academy's records and reports, a frozen world still held the memory of a camp that refused to die, and of a human who had turned cold into fire. Elias smiled faintly and closed the window. The feather lay on the desk, glowing softly in the light, a reminder of what it meant to endure. The polar night was over, but the lesson remained. Warmth was not given, it was made, and he had learned how to make it, even in the heart of the coldest world in the galaxy.